But thank you everyone for being here. I'm Kelsey Swift. I'm a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center. And so I help organize this talk series. This is the first time I think ever that we've been virtual. Obviously, like with everything else, we were making the adjustment this semester, but as we were saying a few minutes ago, I think there are some benefits in that there's a lot of people here and people that are not all in New York. So I'm very happy to have you, and I appreciate your patience as we figure out how to do this all over Zoom. And so today we have with us Maureen Matarese. Maureen Matarese is a tenured full professor at Brough Manhattan Community College. She has a master's in English from North Carolina State University, and she is a graduate of Teachers College, Columbia University, with a master's in applied linguistics and a doctorate in international education development. At BMCC, Dr. Matarese's teaching revolves around discourse analysis and addressing the racism, homophobia, and xenophobia inherent in prescriptive and folk linguistic ideologies surrounding non-standard varieties of English. Dr. Matarese's academic pursuits examine institutional discourse in criminal justice, educational, and social work settings. Her current research examines how practitioners in social institutions such as homeless shelters, police institutions, and schools put policies into practice through their everyday talk. In doing so, she has found new explanations for why practitioners in certain social institutions talk to clients the way they do. Her work breaks new ground in institutional talk, locating neoliberal discourses in the minutiae of everyday talk in seemingly disparate social institutions. She has published in Discourse Processes, Text and Talk, the Journal of Applied Linguistics and Professional Practice, British Journal of Social Work, and the Journal of Child and Family Social Work. And she is co-editor and contributor to Analyzing Social Work Communication, Discourse and Practice. She is a newly elected member of the UFS Executive Committee. She is also appointed as the alternate for the Board of Trustees Committee on Faculty, Staff, and Administration, and as the liaison to the UFS status of the Faculty Committee. She continues to chair the Community College Caucus of the Senate. At BMCC, she founded the Community College Participatory Action Research Collaborative, a research center run by community college faculty, students, staff, and administration. Since 2018, she's been a member of the Academic Senate, a chair of the Student Affairs Subcommittee, and a member of the BMCC Academic Senate Executive Committee. So I was going to say, join me in welcoming Maureen Matarese. I'm imagining clapping, but you can clap where you are, use your reactions, all of that. While Maureen is talking, I'm going to keep everyone muted, but we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. I just have to say how lovely it is to see all of you. I get to see lots of you in individual moments, but and individual Zoom calls, but it's nice to have just a collective body of folks. And I don't know, I feel very supported. So thanks for being here. I put a time on for you guys. Okay, so my name is Maureen Matarese, as Kelsey said. And today I'll be talking about the social construction of policy in social welfare and higher education. So responsibility in talk has largely been talked about in the discourse analytic literature in terms of accounts. And accounts are great. And in fact, Professor Caswell and I have done lots of work in various settings on accounts and accountability. But they often describe the thing that comes after an assertion or query of responsibility, leaving constructions of responsibility themselves kind of under-theorized. And so I'm really interested in how responsibility itself is constructed, and not so much in the accounts that come soon after. So this presentation is focusing mostly on that. And the work that I've done so far has found in social work interaction, and I'll talk about that a little bit today, that responsibility is kind of a constellation of features. And though Hellerman is the first to talk about that, Mondada talks about these sort of multimodal gestalts. And the idea is that there are these kind of things that come into presence through a co-presence of features, that they are kind of, that through all of these features being there together kind of create this new important thing. And so that's a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. So, and is this cut off by your photos? Should I shrink it so you can, is that better? I don't know. Can you guys see the full PowerPoint, Kelsey? Yeah, you can. Okay. So
yeah, we're able.
Cool. So, so my work draws largely on Michael Lipsky's work, Street Level Bureaucracy. So I thought I would start with a brief clip of what we think about when we think about bureaucrats.
I need to type in the coordinates to our whole world, Morty. Cover me. Oh, man. I mean, you know, I don't want to shoot nobody. They're just robots, Morty. It's okay to shoot them. They're robots. Glenn's bleeding to death. Someone call his wife and chill. They're not robots, Rick. It's a figure of speech, Morty. They're bureaucrats. I don't respect them. Just keep shooting, Morty. You have no idea what prison is like here.
Okay. So, in thinking about street level bureaucracy and bureaucrats are often characterized as kind of pencil pushing automatons. They're kind of systematically and mercilessly executing the whims of their administrative higher ups. And in this cartoon, Morty's realization that these robots are in fact living beings kind of maybe mirrors our own experiences with street level workers who use their discretion to make a rare exception in our case, for example. I think a lot about David Byrne's line from a Talking Heads song, and I'm not going to sing it to you, but he says, I think of the people who are working for me. Some civil servants are just like my loved ones. They work so hard and try to be strong. And what I love about both this David Byrne line and also the Rick and Morty sketch is that both of them are kind of highlighting or drawing attention to the individuality and humanity of street level workers. And so you can think about Michael Lipsky's work doing a similar thing kind of on a public policy level. That he's really unpacking or fragmenting the bureaucratic monolith that these folks are just robots kind of systematically doing this work. And instead, he kind of suggests that they are that they have discretion. He acknowledges that discretion and kind of highlights how that discretion is used to actually make policy in the moments that they're delivering service. So what Lipsky says, he talks about street level workers, and he says that they're individuals who mediate between an administration and a client group, and they put policy into practice in their everyday work because of this discretion that they have. And so I have argued in my paper at All Up in 2015 that actually if we can kind of bring Berger and Luckman's social construction of reality together with Lipsky and Erickson's work on discourse, we can kind of see a social construction of policy through institutional discourse. So this is the sort of frame I'm using for this paper. So in terms of research context and data collection, so I'm drawing on two large bodies of work today. One is my dissertation research, which was an interactional ethnography of a caseworker homeless client interaction in a New York City shelter. And it involved 18 homeless clients and 6 caseworkers. And I basically recorded each and every moment, each and every interaction they had with each other, even walking down the hallway from, from when the client entered shelter until when he left, because I was really interested in the sort of boundariedness of their experiences. And I was there for about a year, and I did data collection for 9 months. The current study is an interactional ethnography of a remedial reading classroom in an urban US community college. And just for those of you who aren't in the States, a community college is a 2-year program that terminates in an associate's degree. So the students would need to transfer and take another 2 years or so to get their bachelor's. So in that study, me and 2 other colleagues, Christine, who's here today, we sat in a classroom for the whole semester, recording 10 sessions over the course of that semester. And I should say that the dissertation research is only audio recorded, but the current study includes 3 video cameras in the classroom over that time. And so we transcribed all of this data for both studies. I used in vivo to categorize the themes that I saw coming out of it, and also just to do some initial sort of counting of linguistic tokens. And then I used interactional linguistics to do the actual analysis of the transcripts. And interactional linguistics kind of it's an offshoot of conversation analysis, but it is a focus on language use itself, and also it looks at lexical and grammatical stance. So, and you'll see all of those things coming out today. Those themes were triangulated with interviews and field notes to corroborate my thematic findings, but I think it's also worth it to acknowledge like my own positionality within the community college where I did this research, so that I'm a truly very situated participant observer, having been in this space for 13 years now, observing what's going on at the college. And so I'll talk a little bit about that now. So when I did my dissertation, and for those of you who are working on your doctoral work, maybe this will resonate with you in particular, I was so engrossed in the dissertation itself, and I just felt like it was very separate from the life that I was going to be leading, right? So that I was doing this work on street level interaction in the homeless shelter and saw it being very separate from my own work as a professor at a university, and really felt that like teaching and like the professorship was sort of like a vocation for me, something that I really just love so much and believe in so much. But like when I was doing my dissertation, I was like, you know, I was a big fan of like Bourdieu and Freire and wanted to include all of these folks in my teaching. In fact, I think schools of ed and social work in particular put like a really high premium on theory and sort of the and sort of pedagogy without kind of acknowledging the realities of the work, right? That like when we're in schools, we're like, oh, yeah, we're doing teaching, but also there's this whole kind of bureaucratic architecture that is part of this that we don't often acknowledge in schools of ed and schools of social work. So at any rate, so when I began as a professor, I was hired primarily at the community college to teach a class called ACR, which is Academic Critical Reading. It's a class for students who are not deemed prepared for college level reading. The classes had at the time roughly 55% pass rate. So like about half your students are going to fail each semester. And that changes, right? So sometimes I had 90% pass rate. Sometimes I had a 30% pass rate, right? So, but around 55 was the average. And there was one high stakes final exam that determined the grade, pass or fail, for the whole semester. So, you know, I felt like, you know, in addition to teaching, it was my job to have like tissues and candy and granola bars and bananas. But it was and is not an easy job. So my colleagues, Christine and Elisa and I decided to do some research doing this interactional ethnography in the community college classroom in 2012. And so for me, when I sat in that classroom, it was almost like a tuning fork went off and I could hear the vibrations of that tuning fork resonating in perfect pitch with my dissertation. And I had this aha moment that like, oh my God, I'm also a street level worker. I'm also a street level bureaucrat. And like, what does that mean? And so a lot of this book that I'm working on is my own reflections and grappling with my positionality as a street level worker. Of course, also it's, you know, it's inspired by that, I should say, in some way, although obviously situated in the data. So this book asks the question, kind of, why is a raven like a writing desk? Why should social work interaction in a homeless shelter sound so similar to community college interaction in a remedial reading classroom? Why should there be so many similarities? And Lipsky is just a gem and also provides rationale for that, for why we should look across institutions. He actually says that street level workers, notwithstanding their discipline, actually have analytically similar work conditions, that they are able to sort of, because of their discretion and the kinds of strategies that they have for moving through their work and their day, that actually we can really do a pretty good comparison across these institutions. And so there have been lots of folks that have done that. Maynard, Moody, and Machino have a great book called Cops, Teachers, and Counselors, where they compare across these institutional sets. So there's some precedent for that here. I think it's also important to kind of acknowledge the populations that I'm working with, and that there's also alignment and similarities there that are worth acknowledging. So I've been calling them nesting dolls of stigma. If we think about kind of Goffman's work on stigma, it really resonates with this. That both of the populations in my studies are stigmatized populations within a stigmatized population. So for example, there's, I'm working with homeless individuals, but actually the people that I was observing were hard to place homeless individuals, which means that they were folks with often co-occurring illnesses, mental health, and also a different kind of illness, or previous convictions, things like that, that would make them hard to place. And being by place, I mean moving from shelter into housing. So hard to place into housing. And so there was kind of a stigmatized population within that group. And then at the community college, there's a similar stigma, which is that students are often stigmatized for being at the community college. And that in addition to that, students feel additional stigma. They don't need to. It's, we'll talk about, the structural inequalities that go into creating the challenges of reading in New York City and the rest of the US, if you want. But the community college students often feel stigma. A lot of students tell me like they get flack from their friends for deciding to go to a 2-year rather than a 4-year. They shouldn't, right? It's still great. We're awesome. But remedial reading students in particular also receive a lot of stigma for being identified, often wrongly, as not being prepared for college level reading. So that there's this sort of similar situation in both, where there's this sort of nesting doll of stigma. So basically, this work is looking at how responsibility is constructed in each context over time. And so that's going to be the focus for today. And it basically kind of broken it down into a couple basic elements. So first, responsibility is communicated pretty simply through simple, mundane words. When I was doing my research in the shelter, I looked at the policies for the shelter system, and there was like a client responsibility policy with lots of kind of heavy-handed language about kind of the responsibilities of the client and what they were obligated to do. And I was kind of curious, because when I looked at my data, the word responsibility never comes up once in 1,000 pages of data. Just like nobody says the word responsible, nobody says obligated or necessity or anything like that. No, they just don't. And so I was like, well, like they must be communicating this somehow. So how are they communicating it? So one thing I found, and this follows from Jennifer Coates's work in 1984, she talks about deontic modality, and I would suggest that there are deontic formulations. Deontic means kind of words that point to obligation or necessity, responsibility. So phrases like in line 5, you gotta pick one of these days. And I should say, by the way, of course, all names in here are pseudonyms. You gotta pick one of these days. In line 2 in the next clip, you need to gradually wind your way off this methadone, right? And in line 1 of the following clip, this month, you should be able to save this month. You should put some money in savings, right? So small mundane words like gotta, need to, should, have to, that these are words that actually people are using to construct responsibility. And they seem so small and so insignificant, but actually I'm arguing that they are pretty important. Just checking my time to make sure that we're good. Okay. So in the community college classroom, we found something similar. Lots of use of got to or gotta, like gotta raise hands in line 331. Need to, like in line 1130. Also remember that you need to be reading the next 20 pages. In line 385, or in many cases, you should write these words down. And in line 481, vocabulary is key here. We have to keep expanding our vocabulary, right? So that these small words are asserting responsibility. I should say there are other words that also assert responsibility, including imperatives, which you're going to see in the data, and also conditionals, right? Would assert some level of responsibility. If you don't do this, then I will do this, right? So that there's sort of a conditionality to responsibility sometimes as well. So responsibility can be constructed simply, and I have to credit my colleague Sharon Ovney, I think she's here, for this. During one presentation, she was just like, what's wrong with responsibility? Like, why is it a problem? And my argument here in this paper is that responsibility loves company. So responsibility on its own, like in these examples, it's not so bad. Right? But that responsibility often comes with these other pieces that make it more than just these sort of incipient assertions of responsibility. So one thing that clusters around responsibility very often in both my data sets are neoliberal concepts, references to performance assessments, performance benchmarks, accountability frameworks, timelines, that kind of thing. So let's look at some examples. Oh, and by the way, just for further reading, if you're interested in sort of how neoliberalism comes up in other ways in the data, Dorda and I did a great couple papers on looking at how paperwork practices at the shelter actually kind of are part of neoliberal practices and index those neoliberal practices. So for further reading some other time. Okay, let's listen to this clip.
I'm going to say the same thing. Nah. I'm like, oh, Bloomberg, yeah, it ain't Bloomberg. Come on, I ain't jumping. They got you jumping through hoops. I ain't jumping through no hoops.
Okay.
No.
Well, unfortunately, this is my job, so I got to.
No, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about her.
Right.
Because the pressure's on her, right?
Right. The pressure's on basically all of us.
Okay. Technically, when you come in the door, that's when you're what's that? The IPL, whatever. ILP. That's supposed to take place. So by the time your 9 months do get up, it's supposed to be.
But it's not supposed to be. Let me explain something to you. It's only supposed to be 3 months. You're supposed to be in the shelter.
Exactly.
You've been here 9.
Right.
Okay. So the pressure is on them because this is not. What happened is so people started to make this into a home. Exactly. They started living here 26 years.
It goes on and on. It's a great clip. So if we were to look at this clip, and I should say, so neoliberalism has been widely defined in a variety of ways. When I'm talking about neoliberalism, I'm mostly talking about the ways in which non-businesses become treated like businesses with market mindsets, right? So it's the application of accountability frameworks, performance benchmarks, timelines, performance assessments, and kind of references to institutional bureaucracy that are part and parcel of this neoliberal framework. So let's look. So, So we have deontic modality, right? Again, in lines 18, 19, and 21. It's supposed to be, it's not supposed to be, it's only supposed to be 3 months, right? So we have these references to, we have these constructions of responsibility of these deontic formulations, but then we also have these, right? So in line 4, for example, we have jumping through hoops, I ain't jumping through no hoops. And I think importantly, kind of refers to like the Kafka-esque gymnastics required to manage any bureaucracy. And those of you who are students at BMCC can totally attest, like when you have to like registering for classes, isn't it a lot like jumping through hoops? Trying to get your financial aid paid, isn't that a lot like jumping through hoops, right? So that like these references to bureaucracy are kind of part of referencing the sort of neoliberalism that's part of the system here. So we have that in line 4. In lines 11 and 12, we have the pressure's on her, and then the pressure's basically on all of us. And here, those lines about pressure refer specifically to this accountability system. That's where the pressure is coming from. The pressure is coming from the accountability system that requires a certain kind of performance in a certain amount of time, right? So that pressure is, again, a reference to this accountability system. In lines 14, 16, and 17, we have references to the paperwork that is part of bureaucratic processing at the shelter. So the IPO and ILP. And then, of course, in lines 18 and 22, we have references to these timeframes, right? That it used to actually, what it used to be 9 months, and then they shrank it back pretty soon after I started data collection to 6 months, and then they shrunk it back to 3 months, right? So that the narrative that the client has is different than the narrative that the social worker has for how long he should be in shelter, right? So what's important here is that these things cluster together, right? So responsibility on its own, not so bad, but it starts to kind of attract and bring with it these other kinds of features, and that's what I'm interested in talking about today. So let's look at it in the community college context. And I should say that all of my videos here are blurred just to, not at the request of the participants, but because it is just an ethical procedure in anthropology.
If you come in late, go upstairs if you're there after 8:30, that's fine. But don't come late, be here on time. Also, make sure you have your BMCC ID with you. This is going to swipe you in to get you into the system. should have it every day, but especially tomorrow. On Monday, I'm going to take a midterm exam. I spoke to you briefly about it. It's going to be very similar to the test you took on the first day of class. It's a paper test, it's timed. You use it just to see where you are halfway through the semester. It will help us recognize how well you're doing, how much more work you need to do. And I can't go over the specifics of the test with you, but I will go over your grades with you. As well as many conferences with you next week and we get the results. Please bring a number 2 pencil. Yes. Then this has been our running assignment. Next Wednesday is when this is due. So you have to have finished about half of the book at this point. Finish pages 61 through 80 of Fahrenheit 451.
Okay. So here's the transcript. And again, lots of deontic modality, also some use of imperatives. So we have be here on time, right? Those imperatives, those verb-fronted sentences, be here on time. Deontic formulation, you have to have that every day in line 21. In line 27, how much work you need to do, right? And then line 30, okay, you need that. Right? Please bring a number 2 pencil, right? That imperative bring. And then you have to have finished, right? So again, so we have all of that, the deontic framework is there, right? But then on top of that, look at that, I tried to get fancy, right? So on top of that, we have these, again, references to the institutionality, the bureaucratic functioning of the college. So in line 19, we have your college ID. We also have in line 20, they're going to swipe you in, just kind of, again, part of the institutionality. And in line 21, something I want you to just kind of put in your back pocket to think about in the next couple clips. The use of the word system, I think, is really interesting. Okay, because they're going to swipe you in to get you into the system. And being in the system, I think, is part of what we're talking about here, right? It's part of like being like part of the fabric of this institutional space that happens both in the shelter and also at the community college. So we have those. And then, of course, we have in lines 22 and 25, the references to the timelines, right? The midterm exam and halfway through the semester, right? That these performance benchmarks and timelines are very important in terms of accountability. And finally, I didn't underline it, and maybe you guys would have suggestions about whether I should or not. He says here, in lines 27, 28, he says, I can't go over the specifics of the test with you, but I'll go over your grades with you. I have kind of a funny story about that, which is my first semester at BMCC, and probably Christine doesn't even know this, but my first semester at BMCC, I gave a midterm in my academic critical reading class. And I was like, all right, midterms, okay, students took them. All right, I'm gonna go and make a copy of all the midterm exam and bring it into class so we can go over it together. And so I'm leaving the department with just like a stack of these midterm exams, and somebody was like, what are those? You're not allowed to go, because they use them over and over and over again. So they were like, you can't bring those to your class, you can't go over them. But so I wondered whether the fact that you can't review the exam is in a way sort of a reference to the opaqueness of the accountability system. Like, who is this for? Right? The test should be to test your learning, right? When I give a quiz in class, I want to know if my students learn the thing, right? It's not just to like get a grade, right? Like some sort of output or product to kind of test where we are in the performance management system, right? So I don't know, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. In any case, right, again, we see this clustering of deontic formulations around neoliberalism. And again, if this were the only problem, I'd say it's not so big. But constructions of responsibility also involve constructions and references to negative cultural mythologies. And this is where we start to have some problems and some questions. So in this, I talk about how there are lots of cultural mythologies that come up in the data. Calls to grittiness, Bettina Love talks about how grit, or what we call kind of perseverance, like, oh, you know, just work even harder, you have to get through this, that grittiness is actually something that's disproportionately applied to Black and Brown students. And so these calls to grittiness might therefore be something we should pay attention to in terms of cultural mythologies and negative cultural mythologies. Bootstrapping, the idea of having to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and then attributions of laziness and the freeloader, bad students, you know, bad clients, things like that. So let's look at a couple examples.
I'm not telling you to jump forward, but what I'm telling you is you're going to do something. You're not going to sit here and continue to heavily use drugs the way you used to, and just come in and work part-time off the books and just not doing anything. You know, and like I said before, you taking Wednesday off, good for you, because Wednesday I need to see you getting a psych evaluation. You've been here for months, and nothing's getting done. And then what it looks at and it reflects is I'm letting you skate through the system and utilize the place just to make sure you have a bed every night so you can go into what you need to do. And I can't do that anymore. Understand? I have 40 clients. And I'm being honest. I don't have the patience anymore. I'm stressed. I just don't have it to let you keep skating. Because when they need something from me, I have to be able to produce it. And if I can't produce it, I'm the one that's getting their mind. And so on judgment and being a case manager, I have to case manage you. Now you have to help me help you. You understand what I'm saying? And if you're not,
okay, and thanks to Christine and Dorda, who have heard that clip 100,000 times. I'm sure you could quote it yourselves at this point. So again, like the clips we've seen before, there are deontic formulations that are there. So you're gonna do something. I need to see you getting a psych evaluation. Interestingly, there's some self-referential deontic formulations as well. So in line 17, when they need something from me, right? So kind of highlighting that she's also responsible for things. And then in line 20, now you have to help me help you, right? So again, these deontic formulations are there. But we also have again, these sort of references that are indexical of neoliberal concepts. So references to timelines like months in line 17. We also see in line 7, we have months. In line 17, they need something from me. And again, this idea that part of being in a bureaucratic system like this, in a neoliberal system, is the importance of a product. And producing a product. And so that's again re-emphasized in line 18 twice, able to produce it, and if I can't produce it, right, this idea of production. And then finally at the end, getting the rap at the end of the day, and judgment, these ideas that there is accountability here, right, and that accountability comes with consequences, right? And so we have these kind of references to the accountability system, to timelines and benchmarks, and to products. But we also have these negative cultural mythologies. And some of you who are my students might be saying, Professor, this negative cultural mythology thing, is that like stance? Yes, I'm talking about stance, right? I'm talking about lexical and grammatical stance here, right? So for example, in line 2, you're not gonna sit here. This idea of sitting, I think, is very important because it's something that comes up a lot across the data. It highlights inertness, and part of kind of understanding how the system works is that it should be a process. There should be like kind of constant movement and progress. And we see that in schools as well, right? That you're supposed to have progress, continual progress the whole time. So this idea of being inert is viewed very negatively. So you're not just going to sit here, right? And then she has in line 4 and 5, this extreme case formulation, not doing anything, just not doing anything, right? I should say that Susan Ehrlich in her work talks a lot about cultural mythologies in the work that she does on rape trials and cross-examining lawyers. And she says that the lawyers there kind of employ these cultural mythologies to use in the courtroom. And I think here these cultural mythologies are also employed for strategic use. So we have those. We also have in lines 9 and then again in 17, this idea of skating and like letting you skate. And so letting kind of suggesting like a a gatekeeping kind of mechanism, right? And skating suggesting like ease of movement. This is where I think the freeloader kind of cultural mythology is employed, because she's talking about like, he's getting through too easily. He's moving through the system with too much ease for not doing anything, for just sitting there and being inert, right? And so we have those there as well, right? So together, oh, and I should also say, this data also includes references to the caseworker's own situation. So she's like, I have 40 clients, I'm honest, I'm being honest, I'm stressed, etc. This did not come up in my community college data, but I should say that like, for example, when I was collecting this data, I was untenured, and I 100% said things like this. So, like I try to like level with the students. And in fact, Michael Lipsky suggests that actually street level workers often will use their own situations as sort of a leverage to help gain compliance from the client. So I think we can see she's probably, I think she is, because I talked to her, also very stressed. Like I think it's a legitimate stress, but also I think it's being usefully employed here to get the client to do something that she wants him to do. And again, I didn't see that in the community college data, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So again, look at all the stuff that's there. We just have so much happening. And again, so it's not just these deontic formulations, but what clusters around it that's important. Let's look in the classroom.
So on the second day of class, what did I fill the board with? Who, what, when, where, why? You have to keep going back and asking those questions, even if you don't have answers to the questions. That's why we're doing this. It's one of the reasons we're doing this. So when you learn to talk to each other, instead of just some professor giving you all the answers, you get the answers yourselves. It's much better. It's much more than that. Because I could just come over and tell you what the book is about. Will you have accomplished anything for you that way? That's like reading Cliff Notes. It's cheating. So even if it's a struggle for you, that's perfectly okay. Fighting your way through. Write down the questions. I put about 20 words on the board the other day. Make sure you can define those words. Same way we do the vocabulary exercises. We have to use everything we read to build vocabulary as well.
So we see similar things, and I feel like you're identifying the pattern, right? So we have deontic formulations like you have to in line 5 and write down in line 22. We have the imperative write down. But we also have other things coming up, right? So we have a lot of these cultural mythologies that are surfacing. So for example, in lines 5 and 21, we have these references to perseverance and grit. Have to keep going back and asking those questions. In line 21, just keep fighting the way through. And I think actually in line 20 also, even if it's a struggle for you, right? So the idea of fighting through struggle, right? And again, for those of us interested in stance, right, we're really focusing on individual words here. So like the idea of struggle, the idea of fighting, right? And obviously in the book, I go into more depth with each of these and kind of analyzing each of these phrases as they kind of get unpacked. So we can talk about that in questions if you like. But so in lines 5 and line 21, we have this sort of grit or perseverance cultural mythology coming up. And then we have in lines 9 through 12, and also in 14 and 15, this idea of, again, it's similar to skating, this idea of ease, right? That like giving the students all the answers is like the easy way out, right? And that like the students aren't kind of doing like the hard work necessary to kind of move through the class. And then I think in line 18, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, he says that's like reading Cliff Notes, that's cheating. And I started to think about the primary meaning of cheating in a classroom, right? Like here, I think he means just like you're cheating yourself, right? Like you're cheating yourself, the experience of learning. But the first snap thought when a student hears the word cheating in a class, they think, oh, I just got a 0, right? Like it means that like I copied somebody else's work and I got a 0 and that's what cheating is, right? And so like, I think the use of the word cheating here, even if he doesn't intend it to be this way, kind of like ups the ante in a way on the severity of the problem, right? There's a difference between cheating and cheating yourself, right? So again, we have these clusters of the deontic formulations and cultural mythologies. So the kind of upshot of this entire thing is that constructions of responsibility love company. So let's just look at some examples where they all come together.
He has to attempt to go to another shelter.
I'm sorry, I should say, in this clip, it's a little bit more complicated, so just as a bit of a preface. In this clip, the caseworker is speaking to a Spanish-speaking client, but she does not speak Spanish. So she's brought in another client who is a Spanish-English bilingual person, and he is translating for her to the client. So it's a triadic interaction. And so right now, the caseworker is explaining what she's just said to the translator, who will then explain it to the client.
He has to attempt to go to another shelter.
Tell him the system is changing.
Yeah,
And he sits here all day, but he doesn't know that as he stay here, the system is changing around him. He used to be able to do that, but not anymore. See, and then so since his plan in his mind is to stay in a shelter for 4, 5, 6 months and then figure out what he's going to do, he can't do that. He needs to start thinking about what he's going to do now. Because I can't transfer him to another shelter because it's not an option anymore for us. We have to place these clients. I mean, Bloomberg is like, bring down homelessness, not transfer them. Got to be placed. And so that's the problem. So all the people who's undocumented, VOA don't have a problem paying for tickets for them to go back to their family in whatever country. That's why I offered him that, because some people don't have the money or the connections or whatever. We can take care of that. The problem is he can't wait 5 months and say, I don't want to go if I go through the whole process and then change his mind. He want to stay here because he's not really doing nothing here. Ask him, he's not doing anything.
Okay, está diciendo que tú no estás haciendo nada ahora.
So like the previous examples, we have the deontic formulations that assert and construct responsibility. So he needs to start thinking in line 7, you have to place these clients, meaning, you meaning the caseworkers. And then assertions of what he can and can't do. So he can't do that in line 7 and in line 18. But we also have these cultural mythologies. And so we have his plan in his mind is to stay. And again, the word stay here is very important because I think it is very similar to the use of the word sit, right? It's suggesting an inertness, it is kind of, in this case, the opposite of movement and progression, right? To stay in shelter, right? And so staying highlights that inertness here. And then you want to stay here in line 20, and he's not really doing nothing here, asking he's not doing anything. So we have those two extreme case formulations in line 20 and 22, again, highlighting her kind of essentializing or generalizing about his lack of progress and his inertness. And again, inertness in a neoliberal accountability system is a no-go, right? It's unacceptable. We also have references to the like phrases that are indexical of neoliberal processes. So again, this use of the word system and how the system is working, it comes up a lot. We have references to timelines, 4, 5, 6 months. We have that again in line 18, 5 months. And in line 19, the whole process, again, thinking about this as sort of a bounded, each of these experiences for students, the boundaries of the semester, for the clients, the boundaries are this process of, however many months, right? So again, thinking about these as sort of bounded timelines. And then in line 10, and this is something that came up in an earlier clip that's worth just kind of mentioning, that like the mayor at the time in New York City was kind of used as like a synecdoche. He's kind of representing the whole, perhaps even though maybe he wasn't even involved in this, right? He just said like, yeah, you guys go write a policy, right? But in fact, he is like the stand-in here for the institutional policy. So we have all of these coming together as a cluster, and the same thing happens in the educational context.
He has to attempt.
So just as sort of a note here, Sauce Pudding and Shram, I'm just gonna move this up here so I can read. So Sauce Pudding and Shram talk about how in a neoliberal system, individuals, and that means kind of anybody, has a moral and political obligation to act as disciplined entrepreneurs. They must plan to meet their own needs, accept personal responsibility for their problems, and manage their daily affairs with prudence. The individual who does otherwise fails, not just as an economic actor, but as a moral and civic being. And I think this really resonates with this previous excerpt, right, where it's the client's inertness is not simply an inertness in the system, but that process progress failure is actually constituted as a moral failure as well. And let's look at the last clip for today.
That's good. All right. But you're all here, which is a good thing. Okay. Some of you are making a rare appearance, and welcome back. It's good to see you again. We have, what, three and a half weeks of class left. This is the time your teachers tell you things like, well, you gotta kick it into higher gear. You gotta start working even harder than you're working. So when the teachers tell you that, do you pay any attention? No. No, it's an honest answer. Okay. But it's good advice. The last part of the semester, you guys are all facing the exact same thing at the end of the semester. And take the ACT, sit for the test, do your best, hopefully pass, and get to move on. This is the time of the semester that, yeah, I hope you'll all start working even harder than you're working. But it's also the time to assess what you've done so far. So really look yourself in the mirror honestly. See how hard you've actually worked. You've done all the assignments. You go over the work after we finish it. Have you gone to the reading lab? Have you gone online, worked from home? If the answer to all those questions is no, it's not too late to start. I'm not here to criticize you, chastise you, chide you. I'm here to encourage you not to stop at this point. And if you haven't really started, it's okay to start now. The teachers tell you to kick it into upper gear. What they really mean is you've got 3.5 weeks to work as hard as you can to accomplish your goal. You're in control of that. We'll continue doing what we do in class. Focus on inferences, probably for the entire period. The last 2 weeks, we'll start doing some practice tests as well. We'll go back to the reading lab, do some work there. We're almost finished with the vocabulary book.
Okay. So, and I feel like you guys have got the pattern already, right? But so we have these deontic formulations like you need to and you gotta, right? Kind of asserting what the responsible action is. But then again, in addition to those things, we have other stuff that's coming with it, right? So we have these, again, these cultural mythologies that are coming up. So we have bootstrapping, or I call it a call to bootstrapping. So this idea that we have to kind of work harder and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. So in lines 5, kick it into higher gear, start working harder than you've been working. And then in line 17, I hope you'll start working even harder than you're working, right? So we can, and again, we can unpack these as kind of full sentences, right? Kind of linguistically, if you want later on. And then in line 26, when teachers tell you to kick it into upper gear, right? Again, so this idea of just working harder. And then, but you're in control of that, right? Which I think is the classic idea of bootstrapping. This idea that like, we are in control of our own destinies. And like, this is a fiction, this is a mythology. Like, it completely ignores kind of structural inequality and our, awareness now, I think, of kind of institutional and systemic challenges that prohibit people from moving forward, right? So no, I don't think that we are necessarily in control of that, right? So we have those there as well. We also have lots of references to, and terms that are indexical of neoliberalism. So we have the timelines, 3.5 weeks, the last part of the semester in line 13, the reference to ACT, and I guess we can also say the end of the semester would also be part of that timeline. But the ACT here is that high stakes final exam that the students all have to take, right? So that that is kind of the goalpost performance assessment. We also have in line 18, assess what you've done so far. So asking students to self-assess and saying it's not too late to start. So again, referencing the timeline, and you have to work 3.5 weeks, right? So again, this reference to time, and time is so crucial to how these accountability systems are created and how they work. And I think I skipped it, but I think in lines 18 and 19 and 20, so when he says to really look yourself in the mirror honestly, there's a presupposition there, this presupposition that there's a lack of accurate self-appraisal for the student, right? And so that also kind of tying into kind of cultural mythologies of kind of lack of awareness and things like that. So just so you can see all the stuff, right? So all the stuff on the screen, right? So it's all coming together, all of these pieces together, kind of collaboratively constructing responsibility. So like, what does responsibility look like? Well, again, it can be really simple. And I don't think that the simple ones are necessarily problematic, although I think we have to admit that any adult telling another adult what to do is inherently paternalistic. Right? So like, that's something that we have to just kind of be aware of generally, right? Like if you use imperatives and if you order somebody to do something, or if you use these deontic formulations, like there is a paternal aspect there if you're telling another adult what to do. We also have that these constellations of responsibility bring in these terms that are indexical of neoliberal ideas, performance benchmarks, measurements, etc. And then, of course, we have these cultural mythologies, the lazy student, the bad student, the person needing grit, the person who has to bootstrap, right? All of these things are being brought into play. So what's wrong with responsibility? It's that responsibility loves company, and the company's not good company, right? It's the kind of bad company that stays too long, right? So constructions of responsibility occur through these deontic formulations, but they include often these morally charged paternalistic cultural mythologies that are really nasty. And then these kind of institutionally established performance benchmarks, et cetera. And I think it's important to think about kind of what neoliberalism is, and Sauce-Fording and Schramm highlight that neoliberalism is an affirmative disciplinary regime, and it's particularly impactful toward and hurtful toward Black Americans, and this is something that we're seeing in Bettina Love's work as well, where she's talking about grit in a very different situation, right? She's talking about education, they're talking about social welfare, but really street level bureaucracy is what we need to be talking about, right? We need to be talking about the similarities that we're sharing across all of these institutional contexts. And, you know, I also have data, which I'm not talking about today, on policing, and I've worked with a colleague on looking at that as well. So conclusions, constructions of responsibility often occur in constellations. And that I believe that there is kind of a gestalt of responsibility, that it is responsibility writ large, that we have these sort of incipient forms of responsibility that are kind of small and kind of half-baked and tiny, but we also have this like kind of larger, broader idea of responsibility that can be really problematic. And that these constructions become de facto policies and part of classroom and institutional culture. Interestingly, at the shelter, there was a client responsibility policy, whereas in the community college, there's not any kind of responsibility policy. And I believe that it's interesting, anyway, that the fact that there's no overt policy in the community college highlights that maybe this is just how some people who were set at a disadvantage are spoken to. And that has maybe nothing to do with policy, or less to do with policy than we think. And actually the policy that's actually being created is what's happening in the classroom through the discretion of the practitioners. I think it's useful, and a big hat tip to Jen Delfino for introducing me to this literature. I think it's worth it to think about Bakhtin's work on the chronotope. And Flores et al.'s work, they talked about a ratio-linguistic chronotope. Chronotopes are basically how time and space are related to each other through discourse. And I'm just going to read a quick quote from Flores et al. Because I think it is really just fantastic. They say, quote, "Chronotope perspective allows for consideration of the socio-historical contexts that inform the listening subject position that teachers, and I would argue social workers, are able to inhabit, as opposed to focusing on teachers, and I would argue social workers, as individual speakers, hearers," right? So the teacher and the social worker, they have their best interests of the students and clients at heart. Time and time again, we saw the social worker kind of put herself out there to like not sanction clients, for example, right? And this teacher, of course, you heard him say, like, I don't want to chastise you or chide you. I'm here to encourage you, right? So like, then why are these discourses coming up despite the positive attitudes of the workers, right? This chronotype perspective allows us to think about the relationship between the discursive choices that are made in the classroom and in the shelter context, and how they may be outside of individual attitudes and instead are reflective of the institutional people's roles vis-a-vis like the historical background and baggage of responsibility, which is kind of related to neoliberalism, it's related to early Puritanism, it's related to, right, like there's so much there that kind of is like the historical precedent for like how responsibility is dealt with. And I think a lot of that is being thrust into these institutions, notwithstanding the belief systems of the people that are working there. It's also just worth mentioning, my book also talks about how these constructions of responsibility change over time. I'm not going to talk about it today, but I think it's worth it to note that, like, as Soft Supporting and Schramm suggested, they actually argue that that performance benchmarks inherently change practice. And I actually show how that works. So in the last chapter of my book, I actually talk about how using in vivo, I can show how the constructions of responsibility change over time and increase over time as the clients get closer to that benchmark, right? And then in the classroom, it's a little bit more like an M, where constructions of responsibility in these constellations increase to midterm, they drop off, and then they come back up again before the final, right? And so that these benchmarks, these timelines, this sort of neoliberal framework and accountability system that's part of these institutions really impacts the ways in which we talk to the individuals who are there. And that's it. Thank you so much. Happy to answer any questions you have, etc. Thanks. And I don't know whether I should leave my slides up or whether maybe if people have individual questions about slides, I can put them back up, but I'd love to see all of you also. Okay.
So I think the easiest way to do this would probably be for people to use the raise hand function, and then you can, Maureen can call on you, and then you can speak or type in the chat.
Sure, absolutely. I will say, since there are so many people here, I may not be able to see everybody's hand, so just bear with me. If I miss you, just like shout at me. Hey, Mohammed, how's it going?
Good. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It was a good lecture. So we get a lot of things to know about the responsibility. I just want to ask you something. Can we relate these things to what Freire said about those things that we seen those things during our class?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. So in my Low 100 class, I start off by talking about Freire and about the banking model of education. And my reason for doing that is to both teach kind of what structuralism is and all of these things. Oh, Vanita, thanks so much. It's to teach those things, but also to kind of explain to the students what my own mindset is in the classroom, like where I'm coming from as a professor in some degree. And yeah, so I think Freire comes into play because ultimately Freire has solutions, I think, in some way to help us think about how we can readjust those power dynamics, right? And he doesn't really talk about it on a linguistic level, but like that's something that we could talk about, right? Is like what would we need to do on a linguistic level in order to, is there a way to strip away the cultural mythological baggage that comes along with responsibility, right? Would be a question about how we can kind of readjust those power dynamics. But definitely, like, these roles have power that come along with them. And so part of what Freire is talking about is those power dynamics and how we can kind of readjust them. So that's something we need to think about as a group, like, how do we do that? It's a great question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I see Robin has a hand.
Hey, Robin, I'm so glad you're here.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Wonderful. This is so wonderful. And I was fortunate enough to read some of this earlier. So this is so great to hear you talk about it. Hi, everybody. Lots to think about, but I'm just trying to get my thoughts together. So I hope this makes sense. But I love the nesting stigma of the subjects, I guess.
Yeah.
And I was curious too, have you thought about the nesting stigma of the practitioners, so that people who work in the social services, especially in homeless, like to what degree that there's stigma among community college professors who are generally stigmatized because community colleges are, and the same with the, the social service workers in the homeless shelters.
Yeah.
And so that related to, this idea that they are, so this other kind of way in which neoliberalism is important here is the austerity of neoliberalism and the starving of public institutions and social services.
Totally.
And so, to what degree are some of this language, especially about personal responsibility, a consequence of this starving these institutions? And, especially I was taken by the homeless person, the social worker who's working at the homeless shelter, and her, just how much role strain she had to try to do her job in the context, right? And you didn't hear this as much as in the college classroom, I don't think, but so I was just curious about that. I was curious about the gender of the bureaucrats too. Like, it was interesting that the social worker was a woman, the professor you used was a male. Are you looking at that at all in other contexts? And lastly, how do you think this would play out in a different scenario of non, cash-starved institutions? So I'm trying to think of like, how would this play out in an Ivy League classroom? It does it, or in a banking interaction with a wealthy patron who wants to get a loan. It just, you brought up such interesting phenomenon and interesting possibilities. So I'll leave it there. So great job, Maureen.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you so much. And just a note, I see the Flavio's here, and hello. It's so nice that you're here. And I see David's hand is up, and I'll get to you in just a quick second. So lots of good questions here. I've definitely thought about the nesting doll of the practitioners. I think that one thing that really drove that home for me was thinking about my own positionality as a person without tenure, and the ways in which I tried to level with my students to be like, look, like, guys, because in the class, if there's one high stakes exam, like, nobody wants to do homework, like, it doesn't figure into a grade, so like, why would you do it? So like, folks are frustrated, and I'd be like, guys, like, if my pass rates are low, this is not going to look good for me, right? Like, these kinds of things. So I definitely think that occurs. I would also say that the social workers that I was working with, the caseworkers, were, I think, in a difficult position, right? So for example, they are the lowest rung. Like, there's a body of like MSWs who, like, there are oversee them. Yeah, exactly. And so they are definitely like the most stigmatized. I wish that there were a way to get the same data in the community college with a contingent faculty member who would certainly be the most at risk, for being vulnerable to their job in that position. Somebody who's an adjunct faculty member would really be, I think, employing these kinds of strategies. But again, that's just a hypothesis, and I don't know. But yeah, that's definitely something that I'm looking at as well. I 100% think that this is a consequence of austerity, and all of the squeezing about getting clients out of shelter more quickly is about the fact that there isn't enough money to kind of keep up the shelters because they were like overrun, and that there's not enough money to sort of keep that going if there are that many people staying there, right? So yeah, 100%. I will say in the book, in my first chapter, I do a quick little kind of fun analysis. So I compared, it's something called the Stall Street Journal. It's like a flyer that schools put on the back of bathroom stalls. And I was an adjunct faculty member teaching a graduate course.
You gonna go?
Sorry? I was an adjunct professor teaching a graduate class at Columbia at Teachers College. And of course I was also full-time at BMCC, and they both had a Stall Street Journal. Yes. And the Stall Street Journal at Teachers College was like, are you getting enough sleep? you should read a book for pleasure. You know, have you thought about, you know, you have a family and a life, and, you know, those things need to be part of your everyday, you know, experience here at Teachers College. And like the ones at BMCC were like, are you taking 15 credits? Because, you know, you need to get the hell out of here, you know? And so not in those words, of course. I'm exaggerating, but like there is definitely a difference in the way that both institutions talked to like people peeing. Right. And so like, it's just like, it's a very strange thing to have these kind of voices at you, and how different they were. So I 100% think that there are differences, but again, that's an empirical question. It would require proper data collection in a elite institution in order to answer that question properly.
Your next book.
Yeah, next book. Yeah. I see David has a question, and then maybe Sharon.
Yeah, I guess my question kind of dovetails with the last question tangentially. Kind of speaking of the nesting dolls of, I guess, oppression and stigma. Does your research address the power distance that exists between client and service provider, or student and teacher, and how the person who holds power, their pathway to that role is going to inform their approach to discourse? So like service providers in a social service setting, for instance, tend to have been, or have often been, clients themselves at some point. And similarly, obviously, teachers have been students. Yep. So do you think the framing of like this deontology or the deontological language can kind of speak to that? So like, teachers being more empathetic towards students and framing their deontological approach through empathy, and service providers having been a part of the system themselves in the past, not wanting to pander and kind of not soften their approach to kind of enforce the reality of the situation to the client.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's not really something I've thought about in that particular way, but I think you're right. That's certainly for several contexts, and I would have to go back to look at which caseworkers had told me that they were also part of the social service system themselves. I don't think all of them were. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly a situation in which I think a lot of professors teach the way that they were taught. I think a lot of us tend to derive our best strategies in the classroom from the people we enjoyed the most when we were in the class. I certainly find that I do that as well, and a hat tip to Claire Dannenberg if she's here. But so it's an interesting question about sort of the I suppose it helps to explain perhaps the rationale for how somebody levels, how the caseworker or teacher levels with the student or client. But that's something I'm gonna have to think about a little more. But thank you for the question. I definitely wrote it down. I'm gonna give it some thought. Thank you. I know that's not super satisfying. So Sharon, I think you had a question, and then I see Allison.
Hi, I always love hearing you present your work, and I can't wait to read the book.
Yeah.
And I love what you just said about the bathroom stall kind of literature, sort of the, you know, who's being addressed, who the audience is. I think that's great. I was just wondering about other types of discourses that go on in these settings, and whether discourses, I'm not as familiar with the homeless shelter kind of discourses, but the kinds of things that we hear in community college about, for example, meeting students where they're at.
Uh-huh.
You know, in some ways, like how do those discourses also not only necessitate, but engender community college faculty in a way to engage in discourses of responsibility, if that makes sense? Meaning, like, I think that when you think about things like meeting students where you're at or other kinds of things, these are put forward to make the student experience, the learning experience better.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, they can be taken up in ways that actually are inverted or are are made into discourses that might not be doing that. So I just wanted to bring
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think so. And again, thanks to Jennifer Delfino, who suggested this article. But she suggested this article on racial-linguistic chronotopes by Flores, Lewis, and Fuang. And it's from 2018. It's from Language and Communication. It's awesome. It's such a cool article. It's really interesting. And I think one thing that really resonates with me regarding your question is, I think in their work, one thing that they're kind of highlighting is that, like, at some point, the individual attitudes of the teachers don't quite matter so much. I mean, they do. I think that they are part of it, but that there's like kind of this larger institutional kind of apparatus and the sort of socio-political, socio-historical baggage that like comes with these kinds of terms and ideas. And so like, I think when you're talking about like meeting students where they're at, I think of like my best classes at Teachers College, right? Where we're talking about like pedagogy and like what it should be. And I think that like, rather than talking about like prescriptive education and social work, we should be talking about descriptive education and social work, right? Like, it's like meeting students where they should be or where they're at is awesome. And I think that that is like a great ideal. But I think that one thing that this work tries to kind of capture is that like street level bureaucracy requires that, given the number, like we teach 4 classes a semester, right? So like, how many students is that, right? It's like hundreds of students, right? It's like 120 students or something, right? So, and now it's even higher because they're raising the course caps, right? So like, when you have that many students, what are the things you have to do? What are the routines? What are the ways of kind of saving time, et cetera, that you have to do in order to like make that work, right? Some people will sacrifice meeting students where they're at in order to do other things, like, I don't know, answer email or whatever, right? So like, and again, that's that discretion that Lipsky's talking about, right? Is that like, we have these pedagogical ideals, but I think that like schools of education, schools of social work are so like rah-rah, which I mean, as they should be, about the ideals of the profession, but that like the reality of the profession is a little bit different and also needs to be kind of acknowledged in its own space. So like, meeting students where they're at is great. But like, I think that people use their discretion and that may come at the expense of doing things like that, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah. Allison, I think you had a question.
Okay, I know you guys can't see me, but I think that's for the best.
That's okay, no worries.
Honestly, I think, well, my question is it okay to kind of sympathize with these workers, and not students per se, but the workers and teachers, because I know in a relationship it's 50-50. So as far as we could take it to the client and I would say homeless person, like what I was hearing in the little clip that we heard, the worker was saying that you were here for months, you know, you have to do your part. So I know one can perceive it as like the word she used as negative, but I kind of see it as not tough love, but at a certain point there has to be accountability on your side too. And I know the policies changed from, it was 9 months, then it turned into 3 months, you know.
Sure.
But it's also for the homeless person, I don't like to say that, but the person to be informed themselves. And as far as teachers, I think professors, well, majority of professors try to, they want better for their students, essentially.
100%.
So I, when the professor says, you know, you need to do your part, I think it's out of frustration, because like, you can't just, like, especially like now we're on Zoom meetings, you can't just sit there and not say anything because it's just awkward silence. So I sympathize and I see where they're coming from in a sense. I don't want to say it's completely like left field, because I see both perspectives.
Sure, and I think that's a really good point, and I'm so glad that you mentioned it. So I think we can 100% sympathize with the workers. I think that there can be kind of generous sympathy all around, because the clients and the students are in a difficult position, right? Like they're in a shelter and they're trying to get out. The students are in a remedial classroom and trying to get out of this like challenging gatekeeping class that like if you fail it, you just have to keep taking it, right? So like they're both in like these kind of stressful situations. obviously not the same stress, but stressful situations. And the workers, I think that Michael Lipsky's idea of the street level worker helps to kind of absolve the worker of some of this. And I think the chronotope idea actually absolves some of the rest, right? Which is that this idea that Michael Lipsky says, look, you know, these folks are not robots, right? Like we're human beings, we can't be robots, right? And so that like getting, that this kind of work requires discretion, requires individual choices, right? And so that kind of helps to kind of explain kind of the humanity of the worker. And I think the chronotope idea says, look, responsibility isn't just a thing right now, it's been a thing. And it carries with it all the junk and garbage. It's like a suitcase of responsibility. And that suitcase of responsibility has a lot of junk in it. And some of that junk is totally worth doing, right? Like saying like, look, you know, this is what the rules are and you need to get out by this amount of time. Like that's what the rules are, right? My concern is that what we don't want to happen is to have this, thanks so much. What we don't want to happen is to have this responsibility and then all of this sort of negative, it's like they opened the suitcase, right? And they open Pandora's box of responsibility and all this ugly stuff comes out. And we don't want those things, right? Like negative cultural mythologies don't help anyone, right? So there's sympathy for sure. But like, we also want to like kind of be aware that like these mythologies maybe are not the best for anybody to hear, right? So we have that too. Janola, you had a question, and then Laurency.
Yeah.
Hey.
Hi everyone. Greetings from Sweden. I really thoroughly liked your presentation, and I liked all the nesting dolls and the things and the similarities between these minorities within minorities. And you also gave us a very interesting insight on how sort of pragmatic or discourse collocations really work. I really like all of that. Just have two maybe suggestions, if you don't mind.
Love it.
One has to, well, you haven't heard them yet. One has to.
Suggestions are always good.
Well, when I saw policy talk, I thought first, okay, so have you taken okay, first of all, I'm looking forward to your book, and I presume it's almost ready, so I shouldn't sort of give you any more perspectives anymore.
No,
but
okay.
But there might be a way also, a thing to do something about policy analysis, you know, the input, output, outcome, implementation stuff, and the different stages that they use in policy analysis. And there were really the thing going between output and outcome, that's where language really comes in, and the reading between the lines and so forth. So that's sort of just one thing that, well, you may have thought about that. But then I was thinking about responsibility, and I really like the constructivist way you do this, or trying to sort of see how responsibility is constructed. And yes, it's good to just have a look at the data and see what emerges. But I was also thinking that it might be worthwhile to have a look at and take into account what people have said about responsibility. So for instance, the distinctions between kind of moral responsibility and legal responsibility, personal responsibility and collective responsibility, and so forth. And I was thinking, just as an analytic tool, and I was thinking about your data that really the deontic examples that you have, they really sort of put forth the institutional, almost legal thing. This is the way you gotta do. But then you have all these other things that are really kind of morality inducing, that you have to sort of do it yourself. And that might be another perspective that sort of cross-cuts the neoliberalism, or another perspective on the thing that might also give you something more on this also. But really a great paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I definitely agree with you. In my first chapter, I talk about kind of the history of policy analysis, and Evelyn Brodkin talks about the missing middle a policy implementation, that we know a lot about what happens like as a policy text in of itself, and we know a lot about that output stage, right? But we don't actually know a lot about what this missing middle is, and so that's a lot of what I'm going to look at. Yeah, absolutely. And for the second point, that's awesome, and I'm probably going to email you to see if you have resources or anything like that. I would love to read. Okay, I think Laurentia had a question, and then maybe there was one more. Richard.
Yeah, and I'll say, since we're nearing 3:30, maybe Richard's question will be the last question.
Okay, sure.
I just had more so of a comment to what I think Allison said about tough love when it comes to the homeless shelter.
Yeah.
I used to be in a homeless shelter, and I feel like it's not always the case. When you get into a homeless shelter, it's not always so easy. And you don't get a lot of time to meet with your counselor. You don't get a lot of time to brainstorm on the things that are happening. And it's more so of like, it's a struggle because, of course, I understand that there's many people in the situation. But it's just that if you're not in it, it's really not really tough love. It's sometimes they do judge you because you are less than to them. Like, and some of them are really caring, and I just feel like that should just be brought up. Like they are overworked, you know. They have like 40+ cases, I know, because I've been in one. But it's not always the case. That's just what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think, by the way, if you are interested in, like, if you want to help me like read this, like I would love to share parts of this with you and get your feedback on like whether you think it seems accurate or not. That would be awesome. I think that I agree. The tough love issue is complicated because I think that it often can come from a space of viewing somebody as a subordinate. Right, and so I agree with you that it's like hard to unpack the concept of tough love, right? Like I'm not an expert on that, and maybe someone here is. I would love to hear about kind of your thoughts on that. But I think that like I agree. When you're in the shelter, there's like very little time and there's very little support. And you're not really given a whole lot of information, and then they're just like, do all these things. And honestly, like if you're a student at BMCC with me, then you know, like it's again jumping through hoops. It's all these things you have to do, and nobody kind of lays it out. Although I think that is getting better. They're starting to kind of reframe and kind of streamline the process for students getting in and that kind of thing, which is awesome. But like before, when I was collecting this data, like students were just like wandering around, and they were just like, where's financial aid, and like how many things do I have to bring, and what do I have to do? Like I literally spent time on the phone with the IRS trying to help a student fill out their FAFSA, right? Like it's not easy to like become a student and like do that. And so I think in similar ways, the shelter system is just as Kafkaesque and frustrating to like navigate. And so we have to kind of be aware of that too. Thank you so much for sharing that. Richard, last question, last but not least.
Hi, hello.
Hey.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm okay.
That's good. Good presentation. But since the time, so I have a question. So do you think all of these, like these responsibilities and these that we've been going over, do you think it carries over like our public schools, like how they talk? Because I've seen a lot of it, like they make you say, oh, this is your responsibility. You gotta graduate from high school so you could get a better future or whatever like that. But sometimes most of them, like I meet these students or like, you know, and I know their life, you know, how they're going through sometimes. And sometimes I say, maybe they'll do graduate, but then I don't know how they're going to, okay, here's an example, like undocumented, right? Like they don't get financial aid support, but even if they graduate, they have to like do all these stuff to like scholarships and even though
it's impossible to navigate. And I will say that undocumented individuals in the shelter are also at a massive disadvantage because at least when I was collecting data, you couldn't get placed from shelter into housing without a legal income. So just like, oh no, like what are you gonna do? You know? So it was a true mess. So I think yes. I mean, this is a hypothesis, and obviously we'd have to make a research team, Richard, and go into schools and like properly collect data to see. But like I think so. Yeah, Kate Menken's done a lot of great work on schools and kind of neoliberalism and kind of the institutional realities of schools. And I think her work in public schools would really speak to the kinds of issues that you're talking about, right? The influences of high stakes testing and all of those things. So we've definitely seen that for sure in the literature to some degree in schools. In order to do it the same way, we'd have to collect some data to kind of see if we can compare it. But yeah, I mean, I think it happens very similarly in schools. I think it happens awfully similarly in policing interactions, surprisingly. There's a similar kind of responsibility structure. So it's there for sure. And I think because we're looking at street level workers, because teachers and social workers and all these kinds of folks are not that dissimilar from each other in some very material ways, we can really look at them across these institutions to see what they're doing. All right, I think that's it, huh? Did we do it?
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who attended, who made our first virtual Socio Lunch a success. The next talk is until November. Some of you have already signed up for it, but please tune in if you're around. And yes, thank you again to our speaker.